were discussing about schools of psychology. What were the early schools? We have discussed that early schools were functionalism, structuralism, and third behaviorism we were discussing. We see that how knowledge systems changed with the coming of behaviorism. Psychology was defined as more like a natural science, and the method that was adopted was observable behavior. Psychology should only study observable behavior, and later it was called that behaviorism has done more harm to psychology than any other school that has ever done. We see behaviorism as a regressive and receding step in the system of knowledge, but at that time it was a new era ushered in, as New York Times has said. We were discussing Tolman and Bandura's view. Albert Bandura's system of learning included three components. First was cognitive component, second was social component, and third was environment. So learning takes place with the combination of all these three components: cognitive, environment, and behavior. And it was said that this concept of learning is complete in itself. It gave for the first time a complete picture of learning. This theory was applied to many situations and many problems, like aggression. Bandura has studied on aggression, and he has applied his theories on aggressive behavior, how aggressive behaviors are learned. And now behaviorism is the school of psychology that found its application in various ways. First application was psychotherapy. Yes, both the system of conditioning, operant conditioning, and instrument and classical conditioning were used in psychotherapy. The use of operant conditioning in psychotherapy is known as behavior modification, and second major use of behaviorism we saw in education, what Skinner called programmed system of instruction or programmed learning. How we can program behavior to improve educational learning or educational outcome of a student, how it can be used. The other major contribution of behaviorism was that we see later was positive psychology. When organism was come in the way between stimulus and response, positive psychology found its beginning in the applications of behaviorism. Now, as we ask the question about why Chomsky's review of verbal behavior by Skinner was regarded as the last nail in the coffin of behaviorism. Behaviorism by 40s and 50s was criticized heavily in all systems by many philosophers for the methods it employed, for the very assumption of human behavior. The major criticism was for the observables that behaviorists itself were giving. When in 1950s cognitivism was taking shape due to the effect of information processing technology coming in, work on the artificial intelligence, and the work on other linguistics was taking in, behaviorism was taking a back step. And George Miller, who was regarded as the founder of cognitive psychology, says that behaviorism is simply the evidence, not the subject matter of psychology. And second criticism which came with Chomsky was very influential in the history of psychology, was for behaviorism. As Skinner wrote about verbal behavior, language, he says, like other learning systems, other learning behaviors, language is is based on reward. It can be explained with stimulus response systems, but it was not so, and it was not digested with philosophers, thinkers in all walks of life. But what Chomsky wrote about verbal behavior, the work by Skinner, which came in 1957, and Chomsky wrote its review in 1959, and he wrote that first thing that it was very systematic, and that's why it was called influential. And last nail, first is what behaviorism was ignoring, that we have inner structures. Humans have brain that assist them in learning, and behaviorists are ignoring those inner structures. And yes, we have those systems for language also. And language learning is not like other learning, cannot be explained on the basis of those behaviors. It is domain specific or and specific, species specific. All species does not speak in the same way. Every species has its own language. Humans have more developed language than other human beings, other organisms. So how it can be explained for all organisms? Rats don't speak, but humans speak. How can we explain the linguistic behavior of humans on the basis of the behavior of rats, on the basis of stimulus and response, on the basis of reward? And learning, Chomsky says, it is more complicated. Learning language especially is more complicated than other learnings. So we have to explain learning in a different manner from other behaviors. The other thing that was ignored by Skinner and other behaviorists was creative use of language in humans. Humans speak language. We speak so many sentences. We don't read all those sentences in our life, but we speak. We know very few words. We learn alphabets. We know words, but we can construct so many sentences. So all these aspects were not mentioned in the work of Skinner, and he regarded learning languages as other behaviors. So Chomsky's systematic criticism started a new era that we know today, cognitive revolution, and it gave a voice to so many criticisms coming in coming from various disciplines very systematically. So these were the criticism that mainly closed the chapter of behaviorism only theoretically, not practically, because in practice we still use variables, stimulus and responses. We are still living in the era of behaviorism and not in the new era that has been told to be heralded. Now we come to the new school of psychology, that is Gestalt psychology. Gestalt psychology as a school. What is the meaning of Gestalt? Gestalt is a German word which means whole. Gestalt means a whole, and this philosophy has its roots in various other systems. First is Kant's idea that phenomenological experiences are not reducible to elemental state. We cannot, and it came against structuralist and functionalist idea that we can compartmentalize, we can study the components of consciousness. So Kant, who was a philosopher, says that our experiences cannot be reducible to elemental state. We can only study our consciousness as a whole. So Gestalt psychology find its root in the philosophical foundation in the Kant's ideas. Second effect was Husserl's proposal of two new type of sensations, space form and type form. And third is Christian von Ehrenfeld's development of concept of form qualities. Ehrenfeld's work was on melodies. Ehrenfeld studied that when we recognize or when we enjoy melodies or musical renderings, we don't pay attention to different notes. We don't know that there are different notes from which this melody is composed. We pay attention to a different melody as a whole. So perception of melody was the area to which Ehrenfeld's work was centered, and it affected further development of Gestalt psychology. And major thinkers of Gestalt psychology were Max Wertheimer, Kurt Kafka and Wolfgang Kohler. And their approach, contrary to the structuralist approach, was phenomenological. Phenomenological means the study of meaningful intact experience, not analyzed or reduced to elemental parts. Means experience, we can study experience only as an integral whole. And the interest of Gestalt psychologists was mainly on perception. Perception, they say, has no one-to-one relation with stimulus. What we perceive is not a true copy of sensation, but it is something else. Like they use some figures, we can see some figures here. Like we see a triangle, white triangle, between among there are three circles and there is no triangle very clearly drawn in between, but we see a triangle. It means there is no form, but we perceive a form. And in second picture we see a triangle formed by an angles, and we further see there are three dots besides these angles, and if we see carefully, we can see a triangle forming with these dots. So they say what we perceive in the world depend on how our own thinking, our own experience. It doesn't depends on external world. It is the very famous saying from Gestalt psychologists: the whole is different from some of its parts because the whole depends on the relationship among its parts. And it was a very influential system of thought that affected in various manner the emergence of cognitive psychology. And yes, some thinkers say that cognition was alive in psychology in the researches that Gestalt psychologists were having in the era of behaviorism. Other influences of Gestalt psychology were on perception of motion, how people judge size and appearance of colors under changes in illumination, and the explanation of learning, memory, problem solving. It also influenced work in social psychology that we see by Kurt Lewin, Solomon Asch and Fritz Hader, and other areas were interpersonal relationship and psychotherapy that Gestalt psychology was applied. But it was more centered on perception and problem solving as Kohler's work was. The other influential school of psychology is psychoanalysis. Psychoanalysis, we think that everyone is familiar with the name of Sigmund Freud. And what was the major contribution of Sigmund Freud? What is psychoanalysis? Psychoanalysis is first a theory of personality. Yes, it defines personality as a system of different subsystems. Second, psychoanalysis basically developed from psychotherapeutic background. Freud's work on hysteria was later developed into theory of psychoanalysis. During the treatment of hysteria, he used a method of free association. The patient was told to talk freely, whatever comes to his mind. It was called free association. So it was also called talking cure. During the explanation which patient gave, patients used to come up with their solutions. The method was called catharsis. And the main concept that has changed the world was unconscious, the concept of unconsciousness. Till now, psychologists were discussing about the component of consciousness, the elements of consciousness, but with Freud it came the concept of unconsciousness. Yes, the study of psychology should be the study of unconscious motives also, together with our conscious structure. But unconscious, the concept of unconscious was not given itself by Freud. It was given by Leibniz and Spinoza. And it is very interesting to know how Leibniz developed his concept of unconsciousness. When in 18th century microscope was developed, Leibniz saw some very small organisms which we cannot see with our eyes. So he find out that consciousness exists in a range. Like there are conscious organisms around us which we cannot see with our eyes, and there are certain things which can be beyond our awareness. So he developed that consciousness, there are certain systems, and unconsciousness was the word first time used by Leibniz. But how Freud's work come to be most important as regards unconscious motives. It was systematically applied to psychotherapy and the observations which Freud has given from his clinical studies support his theoretical ideas. What Leibniz has given was only philosophical and rational explanation of conscious and unconscious mind, but now after 100 or more years, Freud was stating his concept with evidences from everyday life. What he said, the title of his book was Psychopathology of Everyday Life. So he was citing the actual incidences of behavior, and he was supporting his theory with those instances. His theory was not only theories in rationalist terms, but it was a psychotherapeutic systems, and it stood very strong with the evidences given from psychotherapeutic cases. So the concept of unconscious mind was a very important concept in the century given by Freud. So the mind, Freud write, is composed of three systems: unconscious, preconscious and conscious. Unconscious mind is the level of our consciousness which is not accessible to our awareness, and it is very difficult to take out things from unconscious mind. And second system is preconscious. Preconscious mind is things are less accessible, but it can be accessed through certain methods. It lies at the border of consciousness. Third is conscious mind. Conscious things are readily available to us. Other things that Freud has given was subsystems of consciousness. These subsystems were id, ego and superego, and these systems has become the part of our terminology. Yes, we all use all these languages very easily, and we know these things. Id is, what is id? He said id works on pleasure principle, and it is only id when we are born. Human beings are only id when we are born. And ego is works on reality principle. Superego is moral part of our personality. So these were, we are not discussing these things in detail. We know there were other theorists working with psychoanalysis, Carl Jung and Adler, who developed their own systems later. But what was the most important contribution of Freud to psychology was system of psychotherapy and concept of unconscious mind. And there are many controversial things with psychoanalysis that came up, but it contributed in a very positive manner. Other developments after 1950s were more broad, more application oriented, but one development, that was humanist psychology. It was more affected by existentialist philosophers, and now again psychology came into the realm of study of conscious experience. They said assumptions were a belief in wholeness of human nature, and it focused on free will, creative power of the individual. And humanist psychology was called third force in psychology. It came against two major systems, that were behaviorism and psychoanalysis. And this school has roots in some philosophical psychologists like Franz Brentano and William James, and Gestalt psychologists who believe in taking a holistic approach to the study of consciousness. And two major things that we know humanist psychology has contributed: one was Abraham Maslow's hierarchy of needs, and second is Carl Rogers' client-centered psychotherapy. And these were the major developments that has taken place after psychoanalysis. And after 1950s, the turn was more to cognitive psychology and to application oriented psychologies. We saw a broad and wide spread of psychological theories, but schools now turn into applications. And now what are the current trends of psychology? These are now currently we can say psychology is more in the direction of neuroscience. What has taken place after 1980s and actually 1940s and 50s, when people were coming from World War, injured, brain injuries, they contributed in the research on aphasia, on brain structures. So how today we study neuroscience, neuronal basis of behavior and its relation to psychology. And second is cognitive science. Today psychologists don't speak in the terms of behaviorism or structuralism or functionalism. It is more a cognitive science, a unified cognitive science, which is composed of, it is an interdisciplinary kind of approach, which is a mix of computer science and psychology, philosophy, anthropology and mathematics. Cognitive science focuses on information processing, how human mind processes information, how knowledge is acquired. Again, the questions that once asked in the beginning, how humans acquire knowledge, are now coming with a different perspective. Now again cognitive scientists are asking how knowledge is acquired, but now the perspective is different. Now the methods are different. Now the techniques are different. Now the work is more based on experimental evidences, more based on neuronal basis, more based on what neuroscientists are revealing technologically. And third is applied psychology. Today psychology has branched into too many application oriented fields. We know today industrial psychology, we know there is counseling and school psychology, there is educational psychology and clinical psychology, psychopathology, and so many branches we have. So theories are contributing in a big way to various fields in life, and psychologists are more focused on the improvement of human life with the help of theories. And one more current trend that we can see is the development of indigenous systems of psychology. What is indigenous psychology and how is it related to global tradition? From the beginning of psychology as a discipline or knowledge as a system, Eastern world has imported all the theories that Western worlds have developed. Western and other underdeveloped worlds have taken theories from Western worlds. But people raise questions that is the theory that is developed in a different culture addresses the questions in the culture that are different, like is a theory developed in America or Europe can be applied in the same way on American culture? Is the theory that is developed in a more developed country, the countries where resources are more, where institutional build-up is more strong, can be applied to a country like Africa, where living resources are very less? So questions of culture raised up, how to apply the same theories to the other cultures. Are different cultures not should not get other different theories? So the question was answered like human behavior is same throughout the world. Do we need theories differently? Like we have theories of motion, we have laws of motion, we apply those laws of motion in all the cultures in equal manner. But cultures are different. So a need was felt to develop indigenous psychology, and today we have Indian psychology, Chinese psychology and Asian psychology. But the question here comes the question of global integration. The question for psychologists today is how to integrate system globally and how to develop culture specific explanation of theories. Integration of systems globally and culture specific theories. So in this way we saw every school was offering a system of its own, a terminology was of its own. We discussed five major early schools: structuralism, functionalism, behaviorism, gestalt psychology and psychoanalysis. What was the main assumption of functionalist school? It was that psychology should study the function and adaptability of consciousness. What is the purpose of our consciousness? What is how it helps in adapting our human beings to environment? And what was the assumption underlying structuralism? Structuralism was aimed to study the component of consciousness, how consciousness is composed of. They say it is composed of senses, ideas and affects. Behaviorism, third school was behaviorism. What behaviorism purported to study? It was behavior, only observable behavior. The method that they used was systematic observation that all sciences follow. In Gestalt psychologist, we see experiments, but they were more focused on perception. And psychoanalysis, it was a form of psychotherapy which gave many concepts which contributed in a big way. So different philosophers, different thinkers were contributing in different ways to the system of knowledge. But there is one thing that we should remember, that no system grows on its own. Every system grows with other things. Whatever developments take place in history or in any system, like developments in psychology were taking place together with what was happening in sciences, what was happening in philosophy, what was happening in physics. So every system was contributing to a specific system, but it was taking knowledge from other systems. No system was isolated or island type of system of knowledge. Now we know more about interdisciplinary contribution of our systems of knowledge, but in fact at every time every discipline was taking things from other disciplines and theories.